What if the person who knew the most was never even questioned? His name is Jim. You've probably never heard of him. And that's exactly the problem. While police built their case, while the world watched one man go to prison, someone else stayed in the shadows. Someone who had access. Someone who knew things. Someone who was connected to the key witness in ways that nobody can explain. This isn't the Chris Watts story you've been told. This is about the man they protected. The man they let walk away. The man who's never had to answer a single hard question. Many people ask why the Chris Watts story remains in the news. Why people want the case to be reopened. And I always tell them his actions deeply hurt his family and touched the hearts of parents and families everywhere, leaving so much sadness that we all feel. As humans, we want to understand the pain and loss caused by this tragedy. To keep exploring this case with care and find answers about Chris Watts' life and whoever is involved in this, please subscribe to this channel. Even though it's harder getting this information, but your support helps me dig in and share more details respectfully. Why is Jim protected? Who is this person? You probably know that NK's phone became a big part of the investigation. Police looked at her search history. They found things that seemed suspicious. Searches that had been deleted. Information that was wiped clean. But here's what most people don't know. Jim's phone was never examined the same way. His records were never pulled. His search history was never looked at. His text messages were never analyzed. And that's really strange, because Jim was talking to NK during this same time period. They were in contact. They were meeting. They were spending time together at work and maybe outside work too. So why wasn't his phone part of the investigation? Look at the dates. In the weeks before everything happened, there are several times where Jim and NK were together. Work meetings, sure. But also other times. Times that other people at work noticed, but that never made it into any report. And here's what keeps bothering people who study this case closely. There were 3 phone calls. 3 calls between Jim and NK that were deleted from her phone. We know they happened because phone companies keep records. But what was actually said, the actual conversation, gone. NK deleted them. Why would she do that? What was said in those calls that needed to be erased? And why didn't anyone ever ask Jim about them? When police investigate something like this, they usually talk to everyone. Everyone who might know something. Everyone who was close to the people involved. Everyone who might have seen or heard anything important. Other people at work were questioned. Some spent hours being interviewed. Their phones were checked. Their stories were verified. But not Jim. His story was never really checked. His timeline was never really confirmed. He gave a basic statement, and that was it. Now maybe you're thinking, well, maybe there was no reason to question him more. Maybe he just didn't know anything. But that doesn't make sense. Because Jim and NK weren't just casual work friends. They had a real connection. The kind where you talk about personal stuff. Where you know what's going on in each other's lives. And NK was going through something huge. She was involved with a married man. A man with a pregnant wife. A complicated, intense situation. Are you telling me she never talked to Jim about it? Never mentioned it? Never asked for advice? That doesn't add up. People who worked with them say they saw Jim and NK together all the time. Having quiet conversations. Meeting during breaks. Talking in ways that seemed private. So what were they talking about? And why did nobody think it was important to ask? Here's another piece that doesn't fit. In the days right after Chris was arrested, when the whole world was watching, Jim took time off work. He disappeared for a while. Nobody knows where he went. Nobody asked. It's just another detail that got buried. But think about this. The investigation happened fast. Chris confessed. He took a deal. The case closed. But was it thorough? Were all the questions asked? Were all the leads followed? Or did investigators decide early what the story was and ignore anything that didn't fit? Because Jim doesn't fit the simple story. Jim makes things complicated. And maybe that's exactly why he was never investigated. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't go away just because you ignore it. And the more you look at Jim's connection to this case, the more questions come up. Questions about his relationship with NK. Questions about what he knew and when he knew it. Questions about why he was left alone when everyone else was looked at closely. And those questions lead somewhere even more disturbing. What if Jim's involvement goes deeper than anyone wanted to admit? What if there's a reason he was kept out of the spotlight? What if his relationship with NK was something that would change how we understand everything? Hold that thought, because what I discovered about their relationship is going to make you question everything. And it starts with what other people saw. People who worked right next to them every single day. As an investigative reporter and a parent myself, this was one of the hardest and touching pieces of case I've ever had to research. Please subscribe. It encourages me to keep bringing you more details about this case. We're committed to bringing you the truth, even when it's heartbreaking. When you work with people every day, you notice things. You see who talks to who. You see who takes breaks together. You notice who seems closer than everyone else. And the people who worked with Jim and NK noticed something. Several co-workers mentioned it. Not in official police statements, but in conversations later, online, in forums where people were trying to understand what happened. They said Jim and NK were always together, that they had a connection that seemed like more than regular friendship, that there was something there that other people picked up on. Now, I'm not saying it was romantic. I'm not making that claim. But their relationship was close enough that people noticed, close enough that it stood out. And here's where it gets really interesting. Jim and NK knew each other before Chris even came into the picture. Their friendship didn't start because of what happened. It was already there, already built. So when NK started seeing Chris, Jim knew about it from the beginning. He was one of the first people to know. Maybe the very first. Think about what that means. Jim watched this whole situation develop. He knew Chris was married. He knew about the family. He knew everything. And he was right there, talking to NK, listening to her, being part of her life during one of the most complicated situations you can imagine. But nobody ever asked him what he saw, what he thought, what advice he might have given. What conversations they had about Chris and what was going to happen. Why not? Here's something else. At work, there were meetings that happened before everything fell apart. Small meetings where Jim and NK were both there. Projects they worked on together. Times when they were alone in offices or conference rooms. Other coworkers remember seeing them together during the same time when NK was involved with Chris. They remember thinking it was odd how much time those two spent together, how they seemed to have their own private conversations. But when police came to interview people at the company, those observations never made it into the official record. Why? Was it because nobody asked the right questions? Or was it because someone decided that line of investigation wasn't worth following? There's a difference between an investigation that's thorough and one that's just trying to close a case fast. A thorough investigation follows every lead, asks uncomfortable questions, doesn't make assumptions. But this investigation made assumptions. They assumed Jim was just a coworker, just someone on the edges, not worth the time. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if Jim knew things that would have changed the timeline, changed how we understand what led to that terrible day, changed the whole story we've been told? We'll never know. Because nobody asked. And here's where it gets even stranger. Jim was never formally interviewed, never sat down in an interrogation room, never had to answer hard questions under pressure. And that's not normal. Let me show you what I mean. In a case like this, police interview dozens of people, sometimes hundreds. They talk to family, friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something or heard something or knows something. And those interviews aren't casual chats. They're recorded. They're documented. They happen in formal settings where people understand how serious it is. Now let's look at who was interviewed in this case. Chris's co-workers were interviewed. Some spent hours answering questions about his marriage, his behavior, anything unusual. And Kay was interviewed over and over, multiple times. Long sessions where police went through every detail of her relationship with Chris, her phone activity, where she was on specific days. Chris's neighbors were interviewed. People who barely knew the family were brought in to answer questions. Even people who had brief interactions with Chris in the days before were tracked down and questioned. But Jim? Nothing. There's no record of a formal interview. No recording. No detailed statement. Nothing beyond a quick conversation that basically went, "Do you know anything?" And no. Here's what makes that so strange. Jim had more information than almost anyone else involved in this case. He was friends with NK. He worked with Chris. He was there during the time when everything was happening. If you were investigating, wouldn't you want to talk to him? Wouldn't you want to know what he saw and heard? Wouldn't you want his perspective? Of course you would. Any good investigator would. So why didn't it happen? I've talked to people who work in law enforcement, retired detectives, people who've investigated serious cases for decades. And when I tell them about Jim, when I explain his connection and the fact that he was never really questioned, they're shocked. They say that's not how it works. That's not procedure. That's not following the basics. They say someone made a choice to leave Jim alone, a choice not to dig deeper, a choice to keep him out of the story. But why would someone make that choice? Maybe investigators just missed it. They were so focused on Chris that they didn't see the other threads worth pulling. But that's hard to believe. These weren't small-town cops working their first case. These were experienced professionals on a case with national attention. So what's the other option? That Jim was protected. Now, before you think I'm talking about some big conspiracy, let me be clear. I'm not saying there were secret meetings and hidden agendas. But I'm saying that sometimes in investigations, people make decisions about what to pursue and what to drop. And those decisions can be influenced by things beyond just evidence. Maybe Jim had connections. Maybe he knew the right people. Maybe there were reasons why looking into his relationship with NK would complicate things in ways investigators didn't want. Or maybe, and this is what bothers me most, maybe protecting Jim was part of getting NK to cooperate. Think about it. NK was a key witness. Her testimony was crucial to the case against Chris. If she was involved with Jim in any way that might look bad, might raise questions, might hurt her credibility, then protecting Jim protects her. And protecting her means the case against Chris stays simple and clean. But is that justice? Is that truth? Or is that just closing a case fast without worrying about loose ends? Here's what we know for sure. Other people connected to this case were treated very differently than Jim. NK's other friends were questioned. Her family was questioned. People she barely knew were questioned. But Jim, who she talked to regularly, who she worked with every day, who knew about her relationship with Chris, he got a pass. And nobody can explain why. Legal experts I've talked to say this is highly unusual. They say in a case with this much attention, this much public interest, you don't leave obvious witnesses unquestioned unless there's a specific reason. So what was the reason? Was it a mistake? Was it deliberate? Was it something in between? We don't know. Because nobody in law enforcement has ever addressed it. They've never explained why Jim wasn't investigated. They've never justified the decision. And that silence says a lot. Because when investigators do their job right, they can explain every decision. They can tell you why they pursued certain leads and not others. But when there's just silence, when there's no explanation, you have to wonder what they're not telling you. Drop a red flag emoji in the comments if you're seeing the same problems I'm seeing. Because we're not done yet. Not even close. If you think what I've told you so far is suspicious, wait until you hear what Jim did the day after they found the bodies. Let me ask you something. Have you ever watched someone you care about get involved with the wrong person? Someone you knew was bad for them. Someone who was lying or leading them into a situation that could only end badly. How did that make you feel? Most people would say frustrated. maybe angry, protective. Now imagine you're Jim. You're close friends with NK. Really close. You spend time together every day. You talk about everything. And then she gets involved with Chris, a married man, a man with a pregnant wife at home, a man who's lying to everyone. And you have to watch it happen. You have to hear about it. You have to be there while your friend falls deeper into this situation that, can't end well. How would that make you feel? Would you just be concerned? Would you try to warn her? Or would it be something more? Something stronger? Something that starts to look like jealousy? I'm not saying that's what happened, but it's a question worth asking. Because the relationship between Jim and NK wasn't normal coworker stuff. It was closer, more personal. And when you add Chris into that picture, you create what relationship experts call a triangle. Three people connected in ways that create tension and competition and complicated feelings. And triangles like that can be dangerous. Let me tell you what people who worked with all three of them noticed. They said before NK got involved with Chris, Jim was always around her, always available, always ready to help. But after Chris came into the picture, things changed. Jim was still around, but there was tension. People noticed he seemed bothered when NK talked about Chris, that he would make comments, small things, questions about whether she was sure about what she was doing. That's what coworkers said, not to police, but to each other. In conversations later, when people were trying to make sense of everything, they said Jim didn't like Chris, that there was something competitive between them, that you could feel it when they were in the same room. Now, maybe that was just Jim being protective of his friend. Maybe he saw Chris for what he was and didn't like seeing NK get hurt. But maybe it was something else. Maybe Jim wanted NK for himself. Maybe watching her with Chris was painful in a way that went beyond friendship. Maybe he was waiting for the whole thing to fall apart so he could be there. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's possible. And in an investigation, possible means it should be looked at. But it wasn't. Nobody ever asked Jim about his feelings toward NK. Nobody explored whether there was jealousy or anything else that might have motivated him. And that's a problem. Because if Jim had feelings for NK, if he was jealous, that changes everything about how we understand his involvement. It means he had a reason to care deeply about what was happening. A reason to maybe insert himself into the situation in ways that mattered. And when you have motive and opportunity and access, you have someone who should be investigated. But he wasn't. Three people who worked with all of them told the same story independently. They said Jim was jealous. They said he didn't hide it well. They said everyone could see it except maybe NK herself. And yet none of that ever made it into the investigation. Why? Because nobody asked. Because investigators decided early this was a simple case. Man has a fare. Man doesn't want to lose his girlfriend or deal with his family. Man does something terrible. That's the story. That's what fit. That's what was easy. But what if the real story was more complicated? What if there were other people who influenced what happened? What if Jim's jealousy played a role we've never understood? We'll never know. Because that investigation never happened. And that brings us to the evidence. The actual evidence that could have answered these questions but was never examined. In modern investigations, digital evidence is everything. Phone records, text messages, internet searches, GPS data. All of it leaves a trail. All of it tells a story. And investigators are supposed to follow those trails wherever they lead. So let's talk about the trails that were never followed. Jim's phone, never fully examined. His text messages with NK were never pulled and analyzed. His call logs were never compared to the timeline. His location data was never checked. Why? If you're investigating and someone has regular contact with a key witness, you get their phone records. That's basic. But it didn't happen. Now maybe you're thinking, well, maybe they did look and found nothing. Maybe they checked and he was cleared. But if that was true, there would be a record. There would be documentation showing investigators requested Jim's phone data, examined it, and cleared him. That documentation doesn't exist, which means either they didn't look, or they looked and decided not to document what they found. Both options are bad. Let's talk about money. In cases like this, investigators often look at finances. Did anyone make unusual purchases? Were there payments that don't make sense? Were there financial connections that raise questions? NK's financial records were examined. Chris's were examined. But Jim's? No record of that happening. And that matters because if Jim was helping NK in any way, if there were transactions between them, if there was any financial tie, we'd never know. Because nobody looked. Then there's location data. Your phone tracks everywhere you go. Cell towers ping your location. Apps track your movements. So where was Jim on the key dates? The days before? The day it happened? The days after? We don't know. His location data was never pulled. His movements were never verified. His story was never really checked. And here's something that should bother everyone. There were items that went missing during this investigation. Evidence that was logged at first but then couldn't be found later. Nothing major. Nothing that would have changed the case against Chris. But small things. Documents. Notes. Things that might have shown connections or conversations that weren't part of the official story. And some of that evidence involved Jim. There were notes from early in the investigation where officers wrote down names of people who should be interviewed. Jim's name was on those lists. But then those interviews never happened and the notes disappeared. How does that happen? Either through mistakes or on purpose. And neither is good. Forensic experts who've looked at this case say there are obvious gaps. Obvious threads that should have been pulled but weren't. Obvious questions that should have been asked. And many of those gaps are about Jim. They say a proper investigation would have included a full look at his relationship with NK, a deep dive into his communications, a thorough check of his story and movements. They say the fact that none of that happened suggests the investigation was either rushed or deliberately limited. And when you're dealing with something this serious, neither is acceptable. Here's what gets me. The evidence still exists. Phone records exist. Financial records exist. The data is out there. But nobody's looking at it. Nobody's asking for it. Nobody's demanding that these obvious gaps be filled. And that tells you something about how the system works. Once a case is closed, once someone's in prison, once the public moves on, there's no reason to go back and ask uncomfortable questions. Even when those questions need to be asked. Even when the answers might change everything. Comment below. Write "Investigate Jim" if you think law enforcement made mistakes here. Because I want to know how many of you are seeing what I'm seeing. We're not done. Not even close. Because the most damning evidence isn't what we found. It's what was deliberately destroyed. And that's where this gets even darker. You know what's interesting? The Chris Watts case should be closed. Should be one of those cases where everyone knows what happened, justice was served, nothing left to question. But it's not. Instead, it's one of the most discussed, most debated, most analyzed cases in recent memory. There are forums about it. Social media groups with thousands of members. People spending hours going through documents and evidence looking for answers. Why? Because people know something's not right. They can feel it. Even if they can't say exactly what's wrong, they know the story doesn't add up. And one of the things they keep coming back to is Jim. On Reddit, there are entire threads about him. Hundreds of comments asking the same questions I'm asking. Why wasn't he investigated? What did he know? What was his relationship with NK really like? On Twitter, people use hashtags demanding answers. Demanding someone in law enforcement explain why this obvious witness was ignored. There have been petitions. Real petitions signed by thousands asking for a more thorough investigation. Asking for Jim to be questioned properly. Asking for the gaps to be filled. And the response? Silence. Law enforcement hasn't addressed it. The district attorney hasn't addressed it. Nobody official has explained why Jim was never investigated. They just ignore the questions and hope people will move on. But people aren't moving on. Because this isn't about conspiracy theories. This isn't about making up wild stories. This is about basic facts. Basic questions. Basic procedures that weren't followed. And when you ignore basics, people notice. People get suspicious. People start to wonder what you're hiding. Journalists have tried to look into this. Real journalists. People who've covered crime for years. And you know what happened? They got blocked. They requested documents. Denied. They tried to interview people connected to the investigation. Refused. They reached out to Jim directly. No response. It's like there's a wall around this part of the story. A wall nobody's allowed past. And that's not how things should work. In a system that values truth and justice, you're supposed to be able to ask questions. You're supposed to be able to investigate. But in this case, all that's been shut down. Why? Were they protecting? Who were they protecting? And what would we learn if someone actually did a proper investigation? I don't know. And that's the problem. None of us know. Because nobody's looking. But the public pressure is building. More people are learning about this. More people are asking questions. More people are demanding someone take this seriously. And eventually that pressure will lead somewhere. Because truth has a way of coming out. Maybe not right away. Maybe not easily. But eventually. And when it does, when someone finally investigates Jim properly, when we finally get answers, I think a lot of people will be shocked by what we learn. So let's talk about protection. Not bodyguards and security, but the kind that happens in the background, where people make decisions that shield someone from scrutiny. Jim has that kind of protection. And the question is why? One possibility is it's just about the case, about keeping it simple, about not introducing complications that might make prosecuting Chris harder. If you're a prosecutor with a clean case, a confession, overwhelming evidence, the last thing you want is some side story that muddies things. Some additional person who might raise questions. So you keep it simple. You focus on the main story. You ignore threads that don't fit. And maybe that's all this is. Maybe Jim was ignored because including him would have been messy. But there's another possibility. What if Jim has connections? What if he knows people? What if there are relationships or reasons why putting him under a microscope would create problems? I'm not talking about massive conspiracies. I'm talking about small dynamics, office politics, the kind of stuff that happens everywhere. Maybe Jim knows someone in the department. Maybe he's related to someone important. Maybe he has friends who can make decisions about who gets investigated. Or maybe, and this is what many suspect, protecting Jim was part of the deal with NK. Think about it. NK agreed to cooperate. She provided evidence. She helped build a case against Chris. But what if part of that cooperation included an understanding that certain things wouldn't be looked at? Certain relationships wouldn't be questioned? That happens all the time. Witnesses get protection. They get deals. They get assurances that cooperating won't blow up their lives. And if NK had things she didn't want examined, things involving Jim, then protecting him protects her credibility. It keeps the story clean. It keeps her looking innocent. It avoids questions about whether she knew more or did more. Lawyers say this is plausible. They say it's the kind of informal agreement that happens in cases constantly, even if it's never written down. And if that's what happened, it would explain everything. Why Jim wasn't questioned. Why his phone wasn't examined. Why all those obvious steps were skipped. Because someone decided closing the case was more important than getting all the answers. But here's the thing. Decisions like that might solve the immediate problem. They might help you get a conviction. But they leave questions. They leave doubt. They leave people wondering what really happened. And those questions don't go away. They sit there, waiting, growing, getting harder to ignore. Someone made a decision to keep Jim out of this story. Someone decided he didn't need to be investigated. Someone decided the questions about him weren't worth pursuing. And whoever made that decision needs to explain why. They need to justify it. They need to tell the public why basic procedures were ignored. But they won't. Because acknowledging the questions means admitting there are gaps. And admitting gaps means admitting they didn't do their job. So instead, they stay silent. They hope people will forget. They hope the case will fade and these uncomfortable questions will disappear. But that's not happening. More people are asking questions now than when the case closed. And that brings us to the one piece of evidence that could change everything. The one thing that, if examined properly, could reopen this entire case. There's one piece of evidence in this case that almost nobody talks about. It's not dramatic. It's not movie material. But it's significant. Really significant. And it involves Jim. In the early days, before everything focused on Chris, officers were gathering information from everyone at the company. They were building a picture of relationships, timelines, who knew what and when. And during that process, one officer wrote a report. A short report. Just a few paragraphs. In that report, the officer noted that Jim had been in contact with NK on the morning everything happened. Not unusual by itself. They worked together. They talked regularly. But here's what makes it significant. The timing. The contact happened early. Very early. Before most people would be awake. Before work hours. Before there was any public knowledge. And according to that report, Jim called NK. He initiated it. Why? What did he need to talk about at that hour? What was so urgent it couldn't wait? And what did they discuss? We don't know. Because that report disappeared from the official file. It was logged. Other officers saw it. It existed. But when people went through the case file later, it wasn't there. Gone. Maybe that's just a mistake. Maybe it got misfiled. Maybe it's sitting in a box somewhere.